Lavrentiy Beria's story is descent into some of the darkest depths of power. To many, he's a name that conjures images of repression, of fear, of the Soviet Union's brutal apparatus at its peak. But today, we're going deeper into the cold facts of history to peer into the chilling details of Beria's life. The life of Lavrentiy Beria is both a lesson and a warning. What happens when one man holds unchecked power? What becomes of a society shaped by fear, brutality, and endless surveillance? And most unsettlingly, what horrors can unfold when a man like him is given free rein? Early ambitions and ruthless ascent. Beria was born in 1899 in a small Georgian village, a place filled with the dust of unpaved roads and the heavy scent of hard labor. Early on, he was captivated by power, its promise to elevate him above his humble roots. As a young man, he found his way into the Bolshevik Party, where his sharp intellect and willingness to eliminate enemies quickly drew attention. In his 20s, Beria distinguished himself during the Soviet takeover of Georgia, organizing purges and proving he could be as brutal as necessary. His effectiveness caught Stalin's eye. Over the next decade, Beria solidified his reputation through calculated ruthlessness, and by 1938, he'd risen to the rank of head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. Now he held the power he had always craved, with Stalin's full trust. Under Beria's command, the NKVD's reign of terror was vast and systematic. One death is a tragedy, Stalin reportedly said, but 1 million deaths is a statistic. To Beria, it seemed even 1 million deaths weren't enough. Between 1937 and 1938, during the Great Purge, an estimated 1.5 million people were arrested in the Soviet Union. Of these, nearly 700,000 were executed, often after short, brutal interrogations and sham trials. But for every execution, countless others were sent to gulags or left in limbo. An estimated 2.7 million were confined in gulags by the 1950s, with mortality rates soaring from these brutal conditions. The NKVD turned daily life into a nightmare. Soviet citizens lived in constant fear of that dreaded knock on the door at night, knowing that friends, neighbors, even family could disappear without warning. A culture of paranoia and betrayal. One of Beria's most sinister tactics was turning society against itself. He established an extensive network of informants that spanned workplaces, schools, and even homes. Children reported on their parents, neighbors spied on neighbors, and paranoia seeped into every relationship. People no longer trusted even their loved ones. Any careless word could be construed as treason. A former NKVD officer recalled how Beria relished this, seeing it as a way to shatter community bonds, leaving individuals isolated and easier to control. Beria's power came not only from enforcing Stalin's will, but from using the state's apparatus of fear to his own advantage. This system became Beria's personal weapon, a demonstration of his absolute control over life and death. Under his rule, the NKVD didn't just hunt criminals, it manufactured them. The stench of death in the gulags. Beria expanded the Soviet gulag system into a sprawling network of forced labor camps, a place of both punishment and death. Prisoners, men, women, and children alike were packed into overcrowded trains that reeked of sweat, excrement, and fear. The long journey to the Siberian gulags was often deadly. Those who survived arrived as emaciated shadows of themselves. On arrival, they were met by the sight of skeletal figures stumbling through the snow, clothed in thin rags, their skin blue from the bitter cold. In these camps, Beria's power extended to the very limits of human endurance. Prisoners labored in temperatures as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit, their hands cracking open from frostbite as they worked with bare, bleeding fingers. They built railways, mined ore, or cut timber, often without proper tools, food, or clothing. Survival was tenuous. More than 1 in 10 prisoners perished from malnutrition, disease, or outright exhaustion. The psychological toll was immense. A former prisoner described the camps as a place where men ceased to be men, where hope and dignity withered, leaving only the desperate will to survive. Death came not with dignity, but as a quiet, lonely end. A prisoner would collapse in the snow, their body rapidly freezing in the bitter wind, only to be carted off and replaced by another. For Beria, these individuals weren't lives lost, but resources spent, a grim extension of his belief that people were merely tools of the state. Interrogation rooms of horror. Beria took personal pride in the NKVD's interrogation techniques, creating a labyrinth of dark, damp chambers designed to shatter the human spirit. Prisoners were blindfolded and strapped to chairs, forced to endure hours, sometimes days of brutal questioning under blinding lights. The smell of sweat and blood hung heavy in the air. Mock executions, sleep deprivation, and starvation were standard practice. Beria often attended these interrogations, reportedly smiling as he watched his victims' terror unfold. The goal was simple: to break individuals down until they confessed to crimes they never committed. Beria's approach was calculated, cruel, and psychologically devastating. Former NKVD officers would later describe how prisoners' screams echoed through the halls, serving as a reminder to those awaiting their turn of what awaited them. He had the evil-smelling aura of a true sadist, Nikita Khrushchev once said, reflecting on Beria's chilling pleasure in torment. The doctor's plot, twisting truth into fear. Toward the end of Stalin's life, Beria played a central role in the doctor's plot, a fabricated conspiracy alleging that Jewish doctors in Moscow were plotting to assassinate Soviet leaders. Soviet propaganda spread these lies, heightening anti-Semitic sentiment and driving public fear. Beria oversaw the arrests and interrogations of these doctors, orchestrating a campaign of paranoia and prejudice. His actions tore families apart and left entire communities in fear. The plot itself was absurd, but it highlighted Beria's expertise in using propaganda as a tool of terror. By manipulating public sentiment and inventing threats, he justified his brutal crackdowns. The doctor's plot is a reminder of how Beria wielded lies as powerfully as any weapon, a tactic that remains chillingly relevant today. Sexual violence as power. One of the darkest aspects of Beria's rule was his abuse of women, using sexual violence as yet another weapon of control. Young women were summoned to his home under pretext of assistance or reward, only to find themselves trapped. His residence was said to have had soundproof chambers where he would commit unspeakable acts. Survivors described being threatened, coerced, and finally violated. Beria would leave them with a bouquet of flowers, a twisted mockery of chivalry that underscored his contempt for his victims. Some victims were never seen again, their fates uncertain. Beria's aides later revealed that he likely arranged for the deaths of many women to silence them. This was not just predation, it was a systematic abuse of his power over the most vulnerable. A reminder that even the personal could be weaponized in Beria's world of control. Recent discoveries have unearthed horrifying evidence that speaks to the depths of Lavrentiy Beria's depravity. The bodies had been stripped of clothing, covered with lime or chlorine, and hastily buried, an attempt, it seems, to erase any trace of their identities. These findings supported the accounts that Beria, notorious for using his power to prey upon vulnerable women, may have murdered many of his victims, disposing of their bodies in the gardens and grounds near his home. The brutal condition of the remains matched the grim tales of Beria's assault and violence, suggesting that his crimes went beyond what was documented and became a part of his terrifying hidden legacy. Further discoveries were reported in the late 1990s and again in 2011 when additional skeletal remains of young women were found during maintenance work in Beria's former garden. Each discovery was a haunting reminder of his twisted reign, his cruelty not confined to just state crimes, but extending into the personal and sadistic. These findings paint a visceral image of him as a man who wielded his power with impunity, and they serve as a somber testament to the lives cut short by his hands. To this day, the remnants unearthed near his home offer a glimpse into the hidden atrocities that took place in the shadow of Stalin's regime, lending even greater weight to the horrors of his unchecked authority. Lessons from a legacy of horror. Beria's legacy is a stark reminder of how unchecked power corrupts absolutely. His reign highlights how surveillance, censorship, and the erosion of civil liberties can shape a society ruled by fear. In today's world, as technology makes surveillance easier than ever, we must consider the lessons of Beria's time. How much privacy are we willing to sacrifice for security? And at what point does that security itself become a threat? His life also reveals the ease with which leaders can manipulate public sentiment, twisting truth into propaganda to incite fear and justify brutality. Beria's legacy is more than a dark chapter in Soviet history. It's a cautionary tale for all of us. When people become numbers, lives become mere resources, and truth becomes whatever those in power wish it to be, society itself crumbles. History shows us the cost of dehumanization, and it's a price none of us can afford to pay again. What do you think? Can people in our modern world learn from Beria's reign, or are we doomed to repeat these mistakes by relinquishing ever greater control to the state in the name of safety? Leave a comment with your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you think about the importance of preserving checks on power in today's world. If you found today's exploration of Lavrentiy Beria's life insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We have more gripping stories of history's darkest figures and their lessons waiting to unfold. Thank you for joining us at War and Wisdom in History. Stay curious, seek wisdom, and we'll see you in the next chapter.